thanks for stopping by Big Top Gaming. My name's Brian, and in this video we're going to be honoring another viewer request for some tactics discussion surrounding Alliser Thorne, Master at Arms. Now, Joseph has not hit me once but twice now for this video, and I figured it was overdue to try and get back to the Night's Watch commanders. And Alliser Thorne is a really interesting and unique one that I'm sure we'll be able to make some really interesting lists with and definitely have some options to toy with if the list I present isn't really to your liking in this one. Talking about Alliser Thorne is going to round out all of the commanders that come in the Night's Watch Heroes 1 box. Now, Donald Noy and Ulfil Yarwick had some very pointed trajectories when I had first looked at them. You know, Donald Noy's game plan is very straightforward in that he wants to exist and endure and hold down areas without giving up any of his units, whereas Ulfil Yarwick is all about overtuning the effectiveness of his units. He can take something that's not so Sworn Brother rules packed and kind of make it more dangerous, especially when we started looking at some of those shooting units. He can really crank those things up over the top. But Alliser Thorne, when they first came out, to me he felt a little enigmatic, and not because he's tricky, but I think that Alliser Thorne just doesn't have like a defined role in the game. So let's take a look at the cards that he brings for the his commander cards for the tactics deck and see how he shakes out. First up, we have Pathetic Attempt. This triggers after a friendly combat unit is attacked if it did not lose a rank. The attacker suffers D3 wounds plus 1 additional wound for each remaining rank beyond the first in that defending unit. If the defending unit happens to contain Alliser Thorne, you automatically count as rolling a 3. So this card has the potential to do 5 straight wounds back to our opponent, and that can be quite devastating. That's a rank plus sum, and depending on if you've had any other attacks going into that unit, this could also just wipe out 2 ranks after the damage is done. So trying to make sure that you're putting Alliser in a unit that's going to be quite survivable is going to be important, or at least it's important to me when building with him, because I think Pathetic Attempt is probably one of his big bomb cards. I think most commanders, just out of the 3 cards, have one that really sings as like, this is the card that will really shift games, and I think Pathetic Attempt can do that quite well, especially when we've got things like Shield that guards the realms of men, along with maybe a few other options to increase our defensive statistics. Pathetic Attempt is definitely something I want to try and build the list with the idea of, because this can be quite helpful on any unit really, but being able to just auto shoot back 4 guaranteed or 5 guaranteed wounds to the unit that's attacking you is a pretty big deal. Next up, we have Seeing Their Flaws. This triggers after an enemy combat unit completes an action, and that's very specific, completes any action, so marching or just making an attack, even if it's something from the tactics board, like the maneuver or combat zone. After they've completed that action, that enemy unit becomes panicked and vulnerable. If they happen to be within short range of Alliser Thorne, you can place this card on top of your tactics deck instead of discarding it. So this is a really interesting take on the Night's Watch tactics. I mean, we have ways of putting out vulnerable tokens through the Rangers, but for the most part, unless you're looking at something like Othel, I think, there's not a whole lot of other ways to really get out these condition tokens. And it's not that it's necessary for Night's Watch, but having this just baked into your card to get some of these really damaging debuffs on a unit without having to commit a whole lot of activation resources to do so can be quite helpful. In the later game, or maybe even in the early game too, it's just whenever, if we have Alliser in a unit that's a little bit more defensive, it's more likely that our opponent's going to be within short range of him, so we could see this card cycling throughout the entirety of the end of the game, especially with Night's Watch ability to almost draw through their entire deck. We could see this coming up quite often, and as the game goes on further, the more impacted your opponent's going to be by having these vulnerable and panic tokens on all of their units just because you've got stuff left in your deck. The last card he ends up bringing is Ruthless Approach. Now this triggers at the start of a friendly turn. You can attach this card to an enemy combat unit until the end of the round, and while it's attached, the enemy suffers the following effects based on what tactic zones you control. If you control the crown, they get -2 to their panic test rolls. If you control the coin, they get -1 to their defense save rolls. If you control the missive, the enemy loses all abilities. If you control the combat zone, they have -2 attack dice, and if you control the maneuver zone, they have a -2 to their movement stat speed. So this card's pretty legit. I like it a lot. This card coming down kind of forces your opponent to start taking zones on the tactics board that they might not want to take. It kind of dictates what your opponent is going to do for the rest of the turn, just to try and ignore some of these debuffs, because frankly they're all quite devastating, and you can kind of pick and choose the ones that you want to get or you can kind of make sure that you're keeping in mind which one of these zones you're going to get when it comes to putting it down on a unit. Like if you're going for something that's not really that has a high morale value, your opponent might not be incentivized to take something like the crown to stop them from getting -2 to those panic rolls. But then if you have the seeing their flaws in your hand, it means that you could probably take advantage of that and take the crown to get that -2 to panic rolls, stack the -1 from the crown on them, zap them, and then maybe get the panic token on them later or even before that to make sure that you've got a really good chance of doing some extra damage to that unit that your opponent didn't recognize. The other good thing about this is you can take a unit that's really tanky or really performing, like one of those high point units, and no matter what you take on the tactics board, your opponent's going to really not enjoy what you're doing to them, because whether they want to lose, if they don't want to lose all their abilities, they're going to be looking at something like the missive, or they don't want to lose their defense saves, so they're going to want to look at the coin for maybe no reason. But the other good thing about this is it also triggers at the start of a friendly turn, so you can activate your NCU during the turn that you play this card and make sure that you get the specific debuff that you want on your opponent. I think Ruthless Approach is another really great card for Alliser Thorne, and when you put his kit together, you can kind of start to see that Alliser doesn't have a focus like those other Night's Watch commanders. Even when we take something like Jon Snow and put him in the mix, I think he's very pointed in how he wants to play the game. But Alliser just kind of has a lot of solid stuff to him. He doesn't have a very particular strategy he likes to go for. He just seems to be quite punishing. And when you look at someone from a debuff perspective, it makes them almost feel a little bit more generalist. And I don't think there are many commanders in the game of A Song of Ice and Fire that do that. I think Tywin Lannister is definitely one of them, but I do feel like you'll have a hard time trying to find anyone who does it just as good as Alliser Thorne. Now, when we look at what he brings to the table, Alliser is a combat attachment, so we'll have that presence on the table for scoring objectives. But he does come with some really cool abilities. The first one is at any cost, and this is just the order that if the unit fails their panic test, he can kill one to automatically pass it. This is a pretty good ability, especially since Night's Watch doesn't have the greatest access to high morale stats. The Sworn Brothers not being, I think they're 6s, which is still pretty good, but you could fail those, especially with things like Vicious running around. So just being able to have this as a failsafe to make sure that your units don't lose a ton of damage to panic tests, especially when we're looking at trying to trigger something like Pathetic Attempt, this could really save you and make sure that that ability goes off without a hitch. The next thing that he brings is a ability that modifies both your ranged and your melee attacks. It's called Prey on the Weak. If the defender has a destroyed rank, this unit's attacks gain +1 to hit. If they have 2 destroyed ranks, this attack also rolls +2 attack dice. So if we've been doing our job with the cards and the rest of the game mechanics that we'll be using, or just the way the game's flowing, Prey on the Weak is going to give us some really great benefits to making sure that we can do as much damage as possible to a unit and crank some of our capabilities up to 11. I think that Alliser Thorne, when you first look at him, doesn't seem like the most powerful attachment, but I think that Prey on the Weak really takes him up to being a contender for being among the best Night's Watch commanders. I won't say he's the best, but he's definitely really good, and Prey on the Weak is has a big part in that. So the unit that I'm going to grab to put Alliser in is going to be the Veterans of the Watch. So this unit I think it's kind of fallen out of favor a little bit with Night's Watch players because the change to Sworn Brothers has really kind of put them on the same level of combat output. It used to be that the Veterans of the Watch were the very sure thing, that you would get this very low decay on the attack value, but with the Sworn Brothers getting their highest attack value upped, I think it makes it a little bit more negligible, especially since they'd probably be doing more wounds over the long run with Sundering and Crit Blow. But the thing that the Veterans of the Watch bring is they bring a good morale stat, so we won't have to get a whole lot of use out of at any cost. But if they do end up failing one of these panic tests and taking these auto wounds, having at any cost makes sure that we don't really feel the burn on that so much, because I think it's much more painful when a high morale unit or a good morale unit ends up failing their panic test, because you're just like, well, that shouldn't have happened and I wasn't planning that. But at any cost gives us a small failsafe. So it's not complete anti-synergy, but it is something that I feel like you won't get a whole lot of utilization in, but when you do need to use it, it's going to be really big. The other huge reason for these guys coming along and with Alliser is that they have a 3+ armor save, and we want to make sure that Pathetic Attempt goes off really well, and having a 3+ armor save will help us with that a lot more than the Sworn Brothers 4+ save. Plus, with the morale stat of the Sworn Brothers, there's a likely chance that we'd be using at any cost more often with them, and we don't want to be taking a ton of wounds with our unit that we have Alliser in. The other thing that we get out of these is just that consistent attack value. So as Alliser starts whittling down a little bit, we can make sure that we're not losing a lot of effectiveness from him. And we can also make sure that we're likely to get more utilization out of the recycling of seeing their flaws, because the Veterans of the Watch can really get into the business and make sure that Alliser is safe and still being able to utilize his presence in the middle of the table to do the ultimate carnage that he wants to bring. Some of the weird things with having the Veterans of the Watch in there is the timing triggers between counterattack and Pathetic Attempt. I am not a timing guru by any means, because I think it's probably one of the most confusing parts of A Song of Ice and Fire. Since these triggers vary so much, it can be easy to confuse what is the same trigger and what is not. And counterattack ends up happening when this unit is attacked with melee, but after the attack dice are rolled. So this still triggers after an attack, and even though the trigger on Pathetic Attempt is worded differently, I still believe that it's the same trigger. You can leave a comment in the area below to let me know if I'm wrong, or let others know if I'm wrong, so that they're getting the right information on this. But I do believe these are the same trigger, and that does feel a little anti-synergistic, but at least we're making sure that we can put out these attacks regardless of the status of our hand. If we have Pathetic Attempt in there and we feel like we're starting to lose, that we will lose a few more wounds off of the attack, we can save it and use counterattack to try and fling some of those hits back at our opponent and still punish them. But if we feel pretty safe and we're not getting any Sundering hits or anything like that, then we can use that Pathetic Attempt to make sure that we're throwing out a boatload of wounds back at our opponent. And just in general, I think putting Alliser Thorne in a unit that's really survival like this almost de-incentivizes your opponent for going after them, so you can kind of play in the sprinkler and go where you want to, because your opponent's not going to be looking at committing a lot of high value resources to taking out this unit, since it's going to be quite difficult for them to do so. Some other options for Thorne are the Bolton Blackguard, and I really don't like that one so much. It's an option, but it's not a great one, mostly because you give up your opportunity to put vows on that unit, and having shield that guards the realms of men is really important for this one. I would almost say that when you play this list, it's one that I would really hang on to until I can get it on the veterans and start getting some good use out of it. Like I said, Pathetic Attempt is one where you want to have that unit survive these attacks, and shields just really make sure that it gets a little bit easier for you. One of the other units that's really difficult to ignore for an Alliser list is the Night's Watch Crossbowmen, or the Builder Crossbowmen, sorry. Now, the reason being is that they don't have the greatest morale stat, so they're definitely going to get some use out of something like At Any Cost. but they also have the ability to apply the prey on the weak bonus that Alliser brings in a lot of different ways. Not so many different ways, but across the board in a wide range, since it's a long range shot, and Alliser can make sure that you're just kind of putting those attacks where you need to, whereas when you're tied to a melee unit, you can't really get that variability. So I definitely see the attraction in doing something with the Night's Watch crossbowmen, but for me, I really think that you're kind of losing out on a lot of the benefits of Pathetic Attempt, and if that's a card that doesn't really attract you as much as it does me in terms of getting that Alliser bonus on them, I think that you could probably switch over to that unit and it wouldn't be a big deal. Next up, we're going to end up bringing 2 units of Sworn Brothers. Now, I think this is the first time I've built a list with Sworn Brothers since the big points change that they had received, so I might be wrong on that, I'm not sure. But to recap kind of what they've done is they are still really aggressive. They hit on 3s. Instead of having 7 dice at full ranks, they have 8, then they go to 6 and 4. They have gone up to 7 points over 6, but 6 was pretty abusive. They were by and far the best 6-point unit in the game, probably almost the best unit in the game, period, at that point. But I'm still bringing them, even with the points increase in here. They're not as survivable as I'd like them to be with that 4+ save, because we are going for that attritional focus on this one. But they are very aggressive, and they should be able to cut things down before they become a problem for that 4+ save. In one of the Sworn Brother units, we are adding an attachment, and it is going to be the trusty Jon Snow. So, Jon Snow also changed a little bit with one of the updates that came with Night's Watch. His actual attachment didn't change at all. He's still quite pricey at 3 points, but giving Sworn Brothers boldness and courage is a really great ability. It takes them up to 10 attack dice at full ranks. Then when they decay, they go down to 8 attacks, and their final attack does 6 dice for that great sword attack, and that's pretty aggressive. And this is kind of putting more emphasis on that attritional play that I've been going for. I'm wanting to do a ton of damage and make sure that over the long run of the game, I can whittle my opponent down, and Jon Snow makes sure that goes on. He also ends up bringing Ghost with him, who received one of the more impactful changes. First of all, the dog is worth a victory point now, which I'm not opposed to or anything, but he doesn't have the ability to ignore armor saves anymore, defense saves. Ghost still has quite a bit of utility with the Silent Predator attack. This just says if you select it, your opponent can't use tactics cards until the end of the turn. And with the bond that Jon Snow brings, it means that you can activate his unit, choose for Ghost to go first to go ahead and charge someone with that Silent Predator attack, and that allows Jon Snow to do whatever he wants to without being impacted by your opponent's tactics cards. So I know we had talked about this being more of an attritional army, and with Alliser Thorne in here kind of being more of like the debuff commander, even though that's not really exactly what he does, but I think it's kind of the closest I can get to explaining what he brings to the table. I think that this is another way of kind of controlling what your opponent can do to allow you to get that attritional advantage. Being able to charge in with Jon Snow's unit, throwing 10 dice right away without them having the ability to react to it through tactics cards is pretty important to making sure we achieve our overall goal with this, is just to try and deny our opponent as much as we can while trying to get their units off the table. The final combat unit that we're bringing will put us up to 5 combat units in total, which is really nice with the inclusion of Ghost. You will want to be a little bit more careful with him. I think that since the auto wounds are not guaranteed anymore, and the wolves are worth victory points, it's probably better to be a little bit more cautious with him and really utilize that bond with Jon Snow in order to take advantage of him. But the other unit we don't really have to be so careful with anymore. We are bringing a unit of conscripts, and I think that people don't look at these as seriously as they really should. Granted, I think Night's Watch has kind of been out of the spotlight lately with the way that Baratheon's Free Folk and Stark have been kind of taking over a lot. But the conscripts are a really legit unit. They got a lot of changes in the same pass with the changes I've talked about previously, most notably the one being that they become insignificant. So previously, this unit isn't statted the best to be surviving a lot, especially under the old panic rules. They have an 8+ morale and a 5+ save, so it was not all that uncommon to just have someone take one charge into them with a unit that was mediocre at best with combat and completely wipe them. So you take your 4-point unit that you've invested in and it just gets shot off the table or wiped off the table somehow without being really effective for what you're trying to do with them. For us, I think this unit's probably going to be hanging back a lot more. They might have the opportunity to go into one of the units that Alliser debuffs, but for the most part, they're going to hold objectives for us. They might be able to unpack for a few things, but having reinforcements on them and the way that panic works nowadays means that your opponent isn't just going to be able to wipe these off the table so easily. And when I had said we were going for that attritional game style, the conscripts really fit into that, since taking them out really doesn't gain them anything unless they're hanging out on an objective, because that insignificant just means that they're not really getting anywhere. They're not getting any further in the game having taken this unit off the table. This is also another way for us to kind of delay our opponent's activations to make sure that something can come up further that Alliser or the Jon Snow Sworn Brothers want to get into. I think that the conscripts are definitely a unit to be feared, and not so much that they do a ton, but at least they end up bringing quite a bit of variability and customizability to the Night's Watch plans, especially since they've got quite a few expensive units. I could see someone wanting to take out the naked unit of Sworn Brothers to add in another unit of conscripts and then just maybe tinker with some of the attachment or NCU options a little bit, but I do think having double Sworn Brothers in here is definitely good and warranted, so there's a lot of flexibility in this list. I think when you have a commander that is so versatile as Alliser Thorne, you really can build the list however you want, and it should function, but I am pointing him in a very specific direction. Getting to the NCUs for this list, I think we're going to end up turning a couple heads with the suite that I've decided to go with on this one. First off is probably not so controversial of a pick, is going to be Craster. And Craster is, when you first look at him, he's not really that big of a deal, especially since he has to reject the ability of the tactic zone that you're claiming by using his abilities. So he's kind of like a do-nothing NCU in that way, like if you want the zone's ability. But being able to draw one card and refill a unit by 2 wounds, especially since we've got that Alliser veteran unit that's pretty survivable, that could be quite impactful to your opponent, and this way you're continuing the advantage of having a lot of cards in your hand while still getting some wounds back into the unit. Craster is also really good for blocking a zone you don't want your opponent to take, that you might not really get a whole lot of use out of the tactic zone ability. So the other real big thing that we get out of this is that Craster is only 3 points, and that's going to allow us a lot more flexibility in the rest of our NCU choices. The next one we're bringing is Donald Noy, and Donald Noy can claim the zone, get the ability, and still be able to utilize all of his fun stuff that he brings with us. He has the ability Bolster Defense. Now, that allows him to begin the game with 3 order tokens, and then when a friendly combat unit is attacked, after the attack dice are rolled, you can remove 1 order token from Donald Noy, and then that unit gets +1 to their defense save rolls, and they can't have vulnerable tokens expended on them for that attack. So when I had talked about having that attritional advantage, Donald Noy makes sure that we super get that. If we have Pathetic Attempt in our hand and Donald Noy's hanging around and someone attacks those veterans that maybe have shield that guards the realm of men against them, if we find out that that hit's going to be quite severe but we still want to use Pathetic Attempt, using a bolster defense token doesn't interact at all with any of our triggers and can really make sure that that 3+ save going to a 2+ or taking away the effective sundering is going to make sure that Alliser's unit hangs around so that we can get Pathetic Attempt going off on them. This is also really good for Sworn Brothers because taking that 4+ save up to a 3+ can make sure that they stick around quite a bit too. This is especially great for making sure that the Boldness and Courage ability on Jon Snow stays at its max capacity. I think that Donald Noy is a really great choice as an NCU for this type of list, and I think it'll really prove to be a great inclusion. Next up we have Jeor Mormont. Now, Jeor got some changes as well. I think in the early iteration of Jayor. He just was not really worth doing anything with at all. But I think that his new NCU that has duty to the realms of men is a really legit ability for him. He's an influencing NCU, so he can just attach to a unit, and while influencing that unit, they can get different abilities based on which zones you're controlling on the board. If you happen to have the crown, they only suffer a maximum of 1 wound from failing panic tests. If you happen to own the coin, after defense dice are rolled, you can automatically block 1 hit. And then if you own the missive, you can't be targeted or affected by enemy tactics cards or NCU abilities. So the first 2 are really good abilities for him. I think it means that something like Jon Snow can have this on him to make sure that he's not taking a bunch of panic damage. And then for the extra block on the coin zone, that's a really great one too. It's just another way of making sure we can get our units to last the long haul. But that last one is really the main reason why I wanted to take Jayor. I have a really fond hatred of having NCUs mess with my units, especially when they've got great abilities on them. So I don't want to get Walder Frayed on my Boldness and Courage Sworn Brothers, and I don't want Melisandre hitting any of my units, especially when she can just nuke Alliser's unit off the board with extreme prejudice. So making sure that I can stop my opponent from targeting my big units with tactics cards or NCU abilities is going to be quite helpful. I think that as the game evolves a little bit and Night's Watch players start experimenting a little bit more, I think Jayor Mormont is going to finally shed his skin of being just a terrible pick for many reasons and turn into this NCU that you really like to have. I think I'd talked about a couple times now how important I think Barristan Selmy, the NCU, is to the Targaryen game plan, especially when you're taking something like Unsullied Swordsman. But I think Jayor kind of fits that same role. If you've got something that you want to protect, every single thing he does for them, based on the zones you control, will help them out. And each one of these is a really great zone to control in general. There's a lot of good vows that trigger off of these cards, so you can end up double dipping quite a bit. And no matter what, I guess not no matter what, if you get the activations the way you want them to, you should be able to control 2 of these at a time at least, as if your opponent's trying to deny you a little bit, and that can make a unit really devastating to try and take out when your opponent's really denied a lot of these ways that they'd be utilizing to get rid of that unit or mitigate its impact. So I hope you enjoyed this list discussion. I know that there are a few choices that are a little bit off the wall when we get to those NCUs, but for the most part, this is a pretty good transition from a burgeoning Night's Watch player, right? If you're new to the game and you have that starter box, most of the units that are in the main part of this list are all from that starter. We're not bringing along Aemon or Bowen Marsh. Both are really good, and Bowen Marsh would especially be good for this list, but the points are just a little bit hard to work with on that one. So I think that I could see someone wanting to take out someone like Jayor if they weren't really interested in him, and getting Bowen in here to try and flood through their deck faster. But I do think between Craster and the Horn That Wakes the Sleeper, you should be able to draw quite a bit and make sure that you're getting everything you need, especially since we are pointing this list towards the long game. It means that you are not going to need his ability so much. But I do think that this list does translate well for new players in general, just because Alliser doesn't really have like a targeted game plan. You kind of have to build the list around what you want to do. This one is much more combat oriented and wants to try and fight your opponent off the objectives and kind of have these 2 really hard to kill units running around, just swiping your opponent down activation by activation. So if you have any suggestions for this list, or any way you've been playing Alliser Thorne that is different from the way I've done it, or even if I've missed something completely with how Alliser Thorne is supposed to play, leave them in the comments section below. Otherwise, I look forward to making the next one of these for you, and we'll catch you then.